Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our unit 9. Unit 9 is on public policy formulation. I'm so sorry that we could not have live class because I have internet problem. Yeah. So our today's lecture is going to be public policy formulation, and we'll be looking at basic understanding of policy planning, models of policy analysis, and then we'll also look at stakeholders in planning. Yeah. So I'll take you through the types of formulations that we have. But in brief, you ask yourself, what is policy? Policy is what government chooses to do or what government chooses not to do. Uh, so at individual level, you can also have your own policy. It isn't only government. You as a student, planning your daily activity, going to class at what time, then doing your reading and going for sporting activity at what time, uh, I mean, it's an example of what policy. So at personal level, that we can say that is your policy. But in looking at nations of policy in large, in the general terms, this is where we say government chooses to do what or what government chooses not to do. And we have it in two forms: rational planning, two types of formulation. Rational planning, this is a systematic way of coming out with a policy, or subjective reacting, and this is an haphazard way of formulating policy. And when we say rational or systematic, this is what we mean. Definition of the problems or definition of goals of the policy, or identification of alternatives and plans or alternative plans, and evaluating the alternative plans that you have, and then you go to implementation and of course monitoring. So if a policy is crafted out this way, then this is what is described as the type described as rational planning, or the systematic type of policy formulation. And looking at your previous presentation last Friday, you came out with certain problems on which you presented. Single parenthood, and then majority of you presented on what is it called, child abuse. So these are some of the problems, and you need to define the problem and see if there are alternative uh, things that you can put in place towards finding solution to the problems that you identify during your presentation. So in fact, these are the two types of formulations that we have. Now we have stages. You need to take your policy formulation through certain stages, which if you're talking about strategic, if you're talking about the systematic, you have to follow these stages. And also if it's the haphazard way, also you have to use these steps, but it's not going to be systematic as it is when you are using systematic, what is it called, type of policy formulation. So the stages include problem identification, then you have agenda setting, policy formulation, you have legitimation, you have policy implementation, policy change, and policy evaluation. So we are going to look at them one after another when we finish looking at the model in the next slide. Yeah, policy process model. We call it policy cycle because you start from there, you identify a problem, and then it goes around the process and it comes back to the problem identified through feedbacks. So this is what the model looked like. First of all, as we mentioned, we identify the problem. What actually is the problem that you want to get a solution to? That demand that you come out with a policy. So you need to identify the problem. And problem here means that everybody in that society or community need to look at it as a problem. Example, uh, some of you, what is it called, presented on child abuse. Is child abuse a problem in your community? And is it a problem in a community B? That is, if state of Sarawak see child abuse as a problem, and then uh, Terengganu, and then the other states, they also see it as a problem. You need to identify what sort of problem is it, and then this is where the agenda setting comes in. This is where you try to identify what are the steps and the strategies that you need to take. And then this leads to policy formulation. Immediately problem is identified, then you set the agenda. What is next is policy formulation. This is where you look for objectives, and then you also look for strategies that you are going to use. Then we have policy legitimation. Policy legitimation, it leads to policy implementation, and then it goes to policy change. The policy change here is when you assess the objectives that you set, and then you realize that it's not going to be feasible. This is where the change comes in. You need to change the direction of the policy. Then we have policy evaluation. And when policy is evaluated, this is where you get feedback, and then it goes back to the statement, the problem identified. So this is how the policy process model look like. Problem definition, policy formulation, policy legitimation, policy implementation, policy change, and then you have evaluation. Uh, as I mentioned earlier on, we're going to look at them one after another and see how it is done. Yeah, this is a discussion which I will post in eLeap for you as individual to at least pick one of the concept, the perspective that we discussed the other time: social democracy, conservative, and then we have feminists. Okay, stage one is identifying problems. Yeah, the problem that you need to identify, every community or every society have problems that they are dealt with. So you need to identify what the problem is. A lot of problems are identified, and then these problems are defined as to this is the definition of the problem that will tell you the policy, what will be the policy direction. So in this case, if you identify a lot of problems, it isn't that all the problems are going to get solved. The solution and then or given the attention to the problem is going to be based on the definition of the problem. Then you place them in order of preference, which one is very important or which one need immediate attention. And this is where you initiate policy formulation. Yeah, policy formulation begins with problem definition. So the questions that you ask yourself is, can the problem or problems be defined? If the problem can be defined, then this is where the policy formulation kickstart. What is the major problem or problems that need to be solved? What it means is that a problem should be a problem to the general public and not some selected few. If it is just that very few people see it as a problem, then it becomes very difficult for it to be defined. The second thing is there agreement on the basic problems, or that is what I explained earlier on? Is it a problem that affect the entire population, or is just some selected few that are affected with say problem? Because if it affects very few people, for instance, if it only affects those who are not well-to-do or who have no power in society, very few of them, people might not realize it, and it might not be, most often people who are well-to-do or who are in powerful position, if they have problem, this is where a definition and then many people tend to agree on them. This is another. So more often than not, agreement is sometimes lacking or sometimes disputed, depending on the population that is affected. Now we'll move to stage two. Stage two is policy formulation. Yeah, in formulating, this is where you need to look for alternative policies. If you identify what is it called a problem, and then you set agenda, you come to the stage of formulating policies, then you ask yourself as to whether the problem is really a problem, and then the solutions or the objective that you set as to whether those objectives are feasible. And this is where if the first agenda set is not feasible, then the alternative that you look at based on feasibility. And when you talk about, for instance, the system in Malaysia here, those who are involved in policy formulation include members of parliament. You know, the country is divided into constituencies, and each constituency has a representative called the member of parliament. So most often they identify the problems and then from their constituency, and then they table it as a motion in parliament to discuss, deliberate, and then come up with a policy in guideline that will solve the problem. Then we also have the executive or the bureaucracy. The executive, you know, every country has these three arms of government: the executive, the legislature, and then the judiciary. So in this, those that are involved in these three arms of government is the executive. The executive, comprises ministers of state who forms the cabinet. You have Minister of Health, you have Minister of Education, you have Economic, and then the other. So they have to come out with probably problems identified in their sectors, and they come in. Then we also have government staff, we have interest groups, and then we also, as I mentioned, we have the judiciary as another arm of government. So these are those who are involved when it comes to policy formulation in the country. There are others, but these are the uh, key, groups that are involved when it comes to policy. And then you ask yourself, who designs or who writes the policy? Yeah, public bureaucracy, here we are referring to government agencies. The ministries that I have mentioned, I talked about, and all the departments under those ministries, they are responsible when it comes to public bureaucracy. And then we have the select committees. Most often, select committees, probably let me relate it to parliament. In parliament, we have select committees for health, select committee for education, so they will deliberate issues that concern the sectors that these committees are geared towards. And then we have think tanks. These are individuals or groups or organizations that have expertise in identifying problems and then drafting and then coming out with a draft policy for either government institutions or non-governmental organizations. So it could be individuals and it could be organizations in the country. And then we have interest group, generally interest groups. Maybe we have international interest groups and then we have local interest groups. So probably in Malaysia we could be talking about BESI, BESI 2 or BESI, BESI, I've forgotten the name of the group. Yeah, these are some of the interest groups that maybe we could say political parties could constitute interest group, and then NGOs, non-governmental organizations and then we have what is it called? What is it called? Active civil and the human rights activists. These are some of the interest groups that also have something to do or design policies. And then we have members of parliament and their staff. So these are some of the organization and groups that design and write policies. Some examples here, example on welfare reforms. Problems identified and debated could be increase in the number for unemployed people on welfare. Then another one could be increase in the number of children born out of wedlock. Another one could be parental abandonment, some of which leads to child abuse and many others. And then we also have welfare costs. Yeah, so these are some of reforms from which problems are identified. There are a lot of other areas that are other problems that could be identified for the purpose of policy formulation. So this is the basis or the foundation of when you want to form a policy or come out with policy. Then the third stage is policy legitimation. Yeah, policy legitimation this is where it has a better chance of being implemented or as intended if it is considered to be legitimate. Here the legitimation is whether it is acceptable or it is recognized as a problem, and also as to whether the way and manner and the which is going to be formulated, it is in the interest of the people, and whether it is acceptable, or not. This is where legitimation comes in, and sometimes, most often, when it is identified, as we mentioned earlier on Parliament, it is tabled at the Parliament and then debated on. When it is debated and supported, then this is another way that legitimation of a policy comes in. So people will have to agree. The citizens here agree on a policy and become legitimate based on their member of parliament. As I mentioned earlier on, the country is divided into constituencies, and then each constituency is represented by a member of parliament. So in most often, the legitimation is done by our members of parliament or members who represent us in parliament. They will have to debate, and if it is a policy that will be good for society, then they agree. And if agreed, then it's passed into law, which everybody, stakeholders, are supposed to implement and then follow it as a policy. And then the fourth stage is policy implementation. These are activities that put policy into effect. We have passing the required laws. Exactly, immediately a policy is formulated, at least it means that it has passed through the reading stage at the parliament, and then debates upon, and then pass into law. So the laws that are, put on a particular policy, as to how the policy is going to be carried out, how it's going to be monitored, and then how it's going to be, who are the beneficiaries, and then who are those who are going to carry out the policy. This is where the law is required. So every member or all the stakeholders in this stage, they know what is expected of them, the do's and then the don'ts. Then we also have formulating rules and regulations. Yeah, if the law is there, then you need to have rules and regulations in place. And then, of course, you cannot have policy, talk about implementing policy without a budget. You definitely need to have budgetary allocation for the effective and efficient implementation of the budget. Then certain deadlines as to when the policy is going to be implemented, and then those who are involved, what are the specific activities that they are going to, and each specific activity should have a deadline. So deadline setting is from the point of formulation for policy until the end of the policy implementation, evaluation, and then feedbacks. Then we have assigning the enforcement or implementation authority. Definitely, if a particular, for instance, if it's the policy is on education, then definitely it is the education department that takes charge of it. They become the implementation authority, and if it is about health, the same thing applies. That is why every country has these sectors, and then headed by a sector minister or sector ministry, and then they have departments under them. So when the policy is formulated, let's say education policy, then there's a channel through which it passes from the Minister of Education. If it's about higher education, then it means that it will be under the jurisdiction of Minister of Higher Education. So this is how. So stage 4 is about policy formulation, and then uh, this is the components or the aspects that are some of the aspects that are looked at when it comes to the implementation. Uh, Implementation often involves what is it called delegation, that is assigning duties to departments, and then department also assigning responsibilities and duties to units to carry out the policy. Uh, this one we're talking about whether in government departments or in private sector. These are some of the things. So when it comes to certain area, for instance, when it comes to sanitation, uh, in West Malaysia, I know Alam Flora is in charge of. So if Alam Flora realize that in keeping the cities clean is very is getting tougher for them, they can also get sublet or get subcontractors, and then they give portion of the activity for them to perform. For instance, in getting rid of rubbish in various settlements or communities. Then government confers upon administrative, I mean, rule-making power. That is still part of our delegation. Immediately, government releases some of its responsibility to either its units under government departments or to the private sector. Then at least the government will put in place certain rules, at the same time transfer some of the powers to that entity for effective. Then we have stage 5, evaluation of changes. Yeah, the different types of changes that is expected when implementing or formulating policies include direct changes and then indirect changes. That is, the direct changes is that you make the changes to the policy. For instance, if it's about child abuse, and then you put certain things in place and you realize that it's not going to be feasible, then this is where the change comes in. And then the indirect is that the program goes on, and then along the line, uh, there are certain things do not happen as expected. And also the changes could be short term, and sometimes it could also be long term changes. And then we also have evaluations. Put information, this is we are referring to information that is sent back to the policy implementers in the form of what we call feedback. Normally, a policy has to be in effect for some time. That means that you cannot just formulate policy, implement it today, and then the next day you start to evaluate. Evaluation will you have to give the policy time before, maybe 1 year, 2 years, depending on what type of problem that is identified or what sort of policy is it. But in effect, what it means is that you cannot just have a policy, put a policy in place, and then you start to evaluate it the next day. It's not possible. Then developing evaluation criteria, some examples include effectiveness, and here you'll be looking at the effectiveness, how efficient the policy is, and the fairness, and then you also look at political feasibility here as to whether it's acceptable or not. And then we also have unintended consequences. For instance, you put a policy in place, but without knowing that there are certain effects or negative things that might come in addition or in relation to the policy that is put in place. So these are some of the things that need to be considered when coming out with a particular policy. Uh, which then you also decide which criteria fit the problem identified. Otherwise, if this one is not taken into consideration, these unintended consequences or unintended unforeseen circumstances and problems are likely to crop up. Evaluation may include measurement of changes, That if you identify a problem and then the evaluation here as to whether the problem that you have identified has changed in it or not. Is there any improvement? Uh, this is the measure. This is what you would have already put in place a mechanism in place that you can use to measure as to whether there's improvement in the problem identified or not. And then you have listing of positive and negative changes. Definitely, as to whether the changes that you measure, are they positive or are they negative changes? And if it is positive, then means that it means that the policy is feasible and good. If negative changes, then uh, this is where you need to think again. Then listing of changes that still need to be accomplished. We have cost benefit analysis, and then what is the ethical impact of the law. The law here we are talking about the policy that is put in place. So these are some of the ways that policies are evaluated. And then we have the sixth stage, feedback stage, information that we receive in relation to the impact of the policy. What is the impact of the law that is put in place? And then this is communicated to the stakeholders, and most often the government departments or the government or the bureaucracy that is responsible for that particular policy. Yeah, this feedback is given back to those organizations or departments just to improve upon the policy or the law that is passed or is put in place. Yeah, feedbacks also help in amendments of the policy that is put in place. If the feedbacks are positive or they are negatives, this is where uh, the stakeholders in this particular policy or law implementation authority, this is where they think about amending that particular policy or that particular law. Then learning stages. Okay, so a summary or reflection, rational planning. Okay, we already talked about this one, rational planning and subjective reacting. And when you are going to look at this in reflection or in summary, as we already discussed conservatives perspective, we discuss Democrats, and then we discuss feminists. So in any case, if you are going to use any of this perspective and then using rational planning system, then it has to be systematic in order. Like you need to define the problem, you need to identify alternatives, you need to evaluate the alternative thoroughly, and then implementation and monitoring. When it comes to rational planning or systematic planning, this is what. So it doesn't matter whether you are adopting conservative perspective or democratic perspective or feminist. So far as it is rational planning system, then it has to follow this. And when it comes to subjective reacting or haphazard system, then you identify the problem and then you run to or you move on to implement without identifying any alternative. Yeah, so problem identified, then follow implementation. Or problem identified, then implementation, then you go to monitoring. These are the two forms. So it doesn't matter which one, if conservative, using subjective reacting, then definition, you move to implementation. Democrats, uh, from definition, you move to implementation, or feminists, from definition, you move to implementation. So these are the two differences in a way of summary or reflecting on what we talked about earlier on. And then we come to look at stakeholders. In planning, stakeholders refer to the individuals who are affected by the outcome of the project or the outcome of the policy. So, for instance, if you are coming out with a policy on single parent, so single parents become what is it called stakeholders, and those who are coming out with the policy also constitute another stakeholder, and those who are involved. So they can be divided into primary, secondary, or key stakeholders. Uh, their interest depends on how they are affected. That means that coming out with a policy on single parenthood, yeah, the interest of single parents depends on how, I mean, the benefit that they derive from the policy. The same thing applies the implemented. If it is implemented or if it's formulated by non-governmental organization, they have their interest, and if it's also from a government department, they also have their interest. So the interest uh, depends on how each stakeholder benefit from. So the potential stakeholders include the primary stakeholders. These are the targeted beneficiaries. If you come out with a policy, who are the targeted beneficiaries? Uh, and then we have the secondary, directly who are directly involved uh, with the policy, and then or responsible for beneficiary or the target of the effort. These are the secondary stakeholders. And then we have the key stakeholders. It could be government officials or non-governmental organization or policymakers. Uh, this also refers to those who can influence others. That is, people who have the authority or power in society, and then they can influence. So here probably we'll be talking about uh, uh, opinion leaders. When maybe at the rural areas, we'll be talking about the heads of families or tribal chiefs. And then those with an interest in the outcome of an effort or the outcome of the policy. They constitute the key stakeholders. Now, why do we need to identify stakeholders and their interests? First of all, when you identify stakeholders, then you it brings about quality of policy formulation, because many ideas would have been generated from different angles. For instance, the primary stakeholders will come out with their ideas, secondary what is it called, stakeholders will come out with their ideas, and uh, this brings about effective, then this includes various perspectives. Yeah, when you identify stakeholders, it brings about varied perspectives, and then also it saves you from being blindsided by concerns you don't know about, or strengthens your position. That is, if people are not agreeing to the policy, or people do not agree with the law that is passed on a particular problem identified. And then identifying stakeholders also creates social capital. Yeah, people's capacity are built, and then they are able to contribute meaningfully to their communities. And then also increases the credibility of the organization, credibility of the organization, or credibility of the implementing authority. Uh, because you would have listened to all those who are concerned uh, or who are affected in this, also increases the chances for the success. Yeah, because many those involved would have come in with their input. You pick those that are useful, and then you leave those that are not useful. At the end, ideas from different quarters definitely brings about a successful implementation of a policy. as everybody is geared towards achieving the objective set. Then when should you identify stakeholders? Yeah, as you can see this picture, the hunter wants to enter the forest to kill animals. But meeting one of the animals, this is what the animal has to say. That before you enter the forest, then you really need some stakeholders input. They need to tell you what to kill and what not to kill, or what to do and what not to do. So stakeholders, when should you identify stakeholders? Right at the beginning of the policy formulation, you need to identify the stakeholders at the beginning so that they will not be. So in general terms, stakeholders should be identified early in the process of policy formulation. This is a discussion that I put. Who are those involved in policy formulation and implementation for natural disaster, let's say flood? So try to make a list of different stakeholders involved in policy for natural disaster of your choice. Example, flood in Malaysia. Okay, this is where we end today's lecture. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope uh, everybody is doing well. I remind you to always keep your distance, wash your hands with soap regularly, and then stay safe. Thank you.